Everybody, it's me, Mr. B, and I'm here today to talk about the process of glazing clay. And many of you have probably made something out of clay, a clay sculpture. And what happens when you make something out of clay is you have to let it dry, and it has to dry out for about 3 days. You want to make sure that it's super dry. This is an example of clay that has totally dried out. It's just like a little pancake, but you can see that it's gray, and this is when it's the most fragile. So then once the clay has dried out fully, we have to put it into the kiln, which is basically like an oven that bakes clay. And it bakes clay up to 2,000 to 3,000 degrees. And when it bakes, it gets stronger, it gets sturdier, it becomes like as hard as a rock, a little bit more fragile than a rock actually. But then it changes color a little bit, and now you can see it's white. This is white clay. Then, if you want to glaze your clay, you have to use a special type of art material called glaze. And glaze is like a cousin of paint. And so if you imagine someone takes some glass and pulverizes it and smashes it into tiny little bits and dust particles like smaller than sand, then they mix it with this like sludgy, like slimy stuff, and then they add some color to it, and that is what glaze is. So if you actually imagine a coat of glass on top of your clay, that's pretty much what glaze is doing. It's you're painting glass on top of your clay. So once you do that, the process is not over yet. You actually have to put it back into the kiln one more time, and when it heats up and it gets to that really, really high temperature, it melts and it creates that glassy coat on top of your clay. So when we glaze, there's a few tips and tricks to make sure that your glaze looks as shiny as possible. Here's an example of one of my students that glazed their little cup, and they used red glaze. And you'll probably notice that it's shiny, it looks like really bright and bold and beautiful. This student probably added 3 layers. When you glaze, you have to actually paint one coat, let the glaze set, and then paint another coat, let the glaze set, and finally a third coat. So it does take a little bit of time, but the more layers you add, the brighter and shinier and more beautiful your clay will look when it comes out of the kiln. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. So again, starts as a clay sculpture, dries out, then it gets fired, becomes really strong, really sturdy, still fragile. And then the next task is to glaze. And so today I have a little bird that I made, and I just wanted to show you how I'm going to begin glazing my bird, because there are some other tips that I want you to know before you get started. So we are using Blick Gloss Glaze. And one thing to know about glaze is that before it has been fired, when it's in this like liquidy, painty stage, it doesn't look like how it's gonna turn out like. So it actually will change colors as it heats up and melts over your clay. So this particular color is called Lagoon, and you can see it's like a turquoise, and I decided that I want to make my bird turquoise. So I'm dipping a brush, a clean brush, into my glaze jar. That way, I don't want to pour it out because that could become wasteful. So just get a clean brush to put inside your clay or your glaze jar. And then this is what I want you to remember. If you have Lagoon on this brush, I'm just gonna leave it here with this jar. If I need to use a different color, I'm gonna find a clean brush, because we really do not want to mix the glazes in the container. It will contaminate it and it will change the color for anyone else who wants to use it. So please make sure that we're not mixing our glazes together inside the jar. So hopefully that makes sense. I also would recommend that you get a small brush and a medium-sized brush so you can do some small details if you want. But anyway, let's get started. I'm gonna start by just painting it on my little bird. And notice, hopefully you can see this in the video, that as I paint it on, the glaze dries super duper fast. And that is because the people who made this glaze know that you're gonna wanna add more than one layer. So they made sure that this glaze will dry in like less than a minute, sometimes maybe a little bit longer. But it does require some patience. So I painted just my first coat. Now I'm gonna make sure I add another coat. And it's okay if you like really glob it on there, because you want it to be really bright and beautiful when it's finished. So I'm also leaving the head untouched. I'm figuring out, where do I want this particular color? You might even want to grab like a little piece of paper so that you can turn it on your table as you paint. And please make sure you're gentle. If you accidentally get a color in the wrong spot, don't worry, because glaze can wash off. Just make sure you are as careful as possible. So take your time. Remember that it's always good to have a smaller brush for those smaller details. And the last thing is, try your best not to glaze the bottom, because when I put it back into the kiln, all of this glaze is gonna melt and it's gonna kind of turn into glass, like a molten lava type state. And if it has glaze on the bottom, there's a chance that it could melt to one of the shelves in the kiln. So if you get glaze on the bottom, no big deal, but try your best to avoid glazing the bottom. Whew, I know, that was a lot. That was a mouthful for me, and I know it was a lot of information for you. So please, if you have any questions, ask a buddy, ask your teacher, and you can always rewind this video so that it all makes sense.